All right, everyone, I'm very excited to introduce John Pfaff, who is the professor at Fordham University School of Law, where he teaches criminal law, sentencing law, and law and economics. More importantly, he's the author of not more importantly, because it's very important what you do, but he's the author of a new book called Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. Released just in February. It's gotten a ton of media. It was written up in the Marshall Project. I first read about John's work in a David Brooks column, I think 3 or 4 years ago, where, he was talking about mass incarceration, and he said, you know what, it's the prosecutors, and John Pfaff has the data to prove it. And I think John has really played a huge role in kind of really contributing to this kind of new focus on the role of the prosecutor. And so he's going to give a presentation about the data that he's collected over all these years. So take it away, John.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute and to ACLU for putting this on. I want to start with something I'm sure everyone here in this room is familiar with, but I find it's always a good place to start, which is incarceration's history in the United States. 40 years ago, we wouldn't be here, because between 1925 and around 1975, U.S. incarceration was pretty boring. About 100 per 100,000, about the same as most of Western Europe and Canada, so stable, so mundane, that in the single worst time article ever written by an academic ever, in 1979, Alfred Bloomstein, one of the great criminologists of American history, wrote an article saying it would never rise above 100 per 100,000. Because if it did, we would adjust our laws and our enforcement policies to push it back down to 100 per 100,000. No. He was wrong. We've hit a rate unseen in American history and unseen worldwide. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and the only countries comparable to us are such democracies as Russia, Kazakhstan, and Cuba. Now, since 2010, it's dropped a bit. And reformers looked at this as signs that maybe, at long last, we are finally starting to get our act together. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical because the United States has not experienced a drop in incarceration. California has. And the rest of us are tagging along. If you break this drop out by state, here's what you see. There's California. There's the rest of us. 25 states have seen their prison population grow since 2010. 25 have seen them drop. Since 2010, there are 1.4 million people in prison in 2010. Since that time, we have dropped about 77,000, 5.5%. It's not a lot, but it's not nothing. You don't turn 40 years of steady, unrelenting growth around on a dime. It's to be commended. If you take California alone out of the picture, it falls by more than half. If you take the top 5 states out of the picture, it basically goes away. This is puzzling, because in an era where the Democrats and Republicans cannot agree whether it's sunny or rainy, hot or cold, if it's north or south, they do agree on this. On trying to shrink our prison populations. It is a genuine bipartisan effort. When the ACLU and the Koch brothers sit down together, they both mean the same thing. So why aren't we getting it right? Why do you have so little to show for so much work? It's because we're ignoring the 3 things that matter, or at least we downplay them. And I want to focus on one today. The 2 I won't talk about, one, we emphasize drugs, but the fact of the matter is that 53% of all people in state prison are there for a violent crime. And many of those who are there for nonviolent crime have violent crimes in their prior records. And we generally exclude anyone with a current or prior violent conviction from our reform efforts. If we don't start talking about violence, we will never get this prison population under control. The second thing we talk about too much are private prisons. They hold 8% of the prison population. 92% are held in public prisons. Yet we never talk about the public sector unions. Private prisons made $400 million last year. The public sector guard unions made $25 billion in wages. That's where the power is. They get no attention. I mentioned that at a conference held by the AFL-CIO. I snuck out the back door. What I want to focus on is the third who that we ignore, arguably the most important who, the prosecutor. We never talk about the prosecutor in our reform efforts. And my favorite example of this, not to pick at what I'm sure is a still fresh wound in this audience, but when Hillary Clinton rolled out her end-to-end criminal justice reform program, she talked about changing policing and she talked about changing parole. She never talked about prosecutors. She did not roll out an end-to-end criminal justice reform plan. She rolled out an end-and-end reform plan and completely skipped over the middle. But the middle is where all the work happens and where we need to start focusing our reforms. So what's the basic story? What I found is using data from 1994 to 2008, Strange years, but limited by the data that I had available to me. One important thing to realize, we have almost no data on what prosecutors do. You take what you can get and you do the best you can, which is generally something that you shouldn't do, but it's what we have to do here. But in the end, I wasn't that disappointed by this, because this is the period of dropping crime and rising incarceration. What happened during the 70s and 80s as crime and prison populations went up, that's one causal story. I'd love to know it. We'll probably never have the data to actually figure it out. But what happened as crime goes down and prisons keep going up, that's not going to be the same story. So this tells the story of today. As crime goes down and prisons go up, what is happening? So what do I find? Looking at about 32 states over these years, and they're fairly representative sample of states, I find, one, crime is down. And serious crime is down sharply. Serious violent crime, serious property crime, they're down by about 25% each during this period, even as prison populations rise. And in general, people in prison are not there in prison, as opposed to perhaps probation or jail, but prison tends to be there for something that falls in the category of serious violence, serious property, or drug trafficking, with all the caveats that trafficking entails. Arrests are down. The total number of arrests falls. So we have fewer and fewer people entering the criminal justice system every year, but more and more people ending up in prison during this time. Fewer inputs, more outputs. What's changing? Well, one thing that changes is the probability that an arrest turns into a felony case practically doubles during this time period. I don't know why. I can't tell you if it's misdemeanors being pushed up to felonies or if it's being cases that would have dropped altogether being pushed up to felonies. But whatever happens, that percent rises. And I think it's important to understand how many cases don't actually make it to the felony phase. Out of every 100 felony arrests, the BGS estimates that about slightly less than half disappear before the actual trial phase or the plea bargaining phase. My numbers differ slightly, but the same general pattern. A lot of cases disappear, but a greater fraction are ending up as felony cases. Once that felony charge is filed, the probability that you go to prison doesn't change at all. 1 in 4 felony cases in 1994, 1 in 4 felony cases in 2008. We just have a lot more felony cases by 2008. Once you go to prison, the amount of time you spend in prison doesn't change. And the amount of time you spend in prison is less than people think. I recently asked a bunch of undergrads, what did they, at a very good school, what did they think the median time spent in prison by someone convicted of violence was? I got back 20, 30, 40, and 50 years. It's 4. The median time for a violent crime is 4 years. For a drug and property crime, it's 1 year. We are not driven by long sentences. The growth is driven by adding more and more admissions every single year to serve relatively short times and then get booted out of prison. The only thing that changed during this time was the probability that an arrest turns into a felony case. The only thing that changed during this time is an act that falls entirely and exclusively within the discretion of the prosecutor or their office. So the individual line ADA might not have much discretion, but the guy at the top does. Right? So that raises an interesting question. Why have they gotten more aggressive? Short answer, no idea. Right? Because the short answer is I have no numbers. And I don't know anything without numbers. I have no numbers in a way I don't know anything. But I have some theories, and I have rough numbers here and there to back up these theories. So what has changed during this time? Well, one is that our adversarial system is increasingly non-adversarial. Public defense has been crippled. 80% of all people facing a prison sentence or a jail sentence qualify for a state-provided attorney. Yet of the $200 billion we spend every year on criminal justice nationwide at the state and local level, we spend about $4.5 billion of that on indigent defense, about 2%. That was from 2007. That's the newest, most up-to-date number we have, is a decade old. We spend $4.5 billion on defense. We spend $6 billion a year on prosecution at that same time. So we spend more on prosecution, but it's actually worse. North Carolina's Office of Indigent Defense did a study in which they noted the fact that the nominal budget for public defense and prosecution were the same. But the catch is that public defenders have to hire their investigators. They have to pay for their DNA testing. They pay for everything. The prosecution, they don't pay for their investigators because their investigators call the police department. They don't pay for their DNA services because it was a state DNA lab. And you add in all those free services, the budget for prosecutors in North Carolina was triple that of the public defenders. You hear stories that public defenders have an average in some places of 8 minutes with their client. You hear other stories that in North Dakota or South Dakota, I apologize for being the terrible New Yorker who's getting those wrong, you pay for your public defender. You pay $90 an hour. And if you pay whether you are convicted or acquitted. And if you cannot pay your public defender, that's a crime to not pay the public defender who just got you acquitted. Right? So we talk about an adversarial system where the adversary is fundamentally underfunded. And I should point out, I should make this a qualifying point, had I not gone, just to put my biases on full display, had I not gone into teaching, I would have been a prosecutor coming out of law school. If I were kicked out of teaching today, I would still end up in a prosecutor's office. I wouldn't get promoted quickly, I would imagine, given where I stand today. But that's where my biases fall. I think that's worth pointing out. Better policing. We're not arresting more people. Our clearance rate, what % of crimes turn into an arrest, that has been flat or falling since 1970. But maybe we're getting better cases, right? Better cameras, better DNA. And so it's just easier for prosecutors to convict cases now than it was in the 1970s. Tougher sentences. No one's spending more time in prison. The time spent in prison hasn't changed, but our sentencing laws have gotten tougher. Maybe it's easier to pound out plea bargains this way. 15 years ago, take this 7-year deal, take this 5-year deal or face 7 years. Now take this 5-year deal or face 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. You get those pleas faster. No idea. Right? It's possible. 95% of all cases, guilty pleas come from a plea bargain. 90% of all guilty outcomes come from a plea bargain. And I have no data on how plea bargaining operates. Just none. But the theory that explains it the most to me right now is actually the most boring. And that's kind of the defining nature of my work. The things that matter most are the most boring, dry stuff that no one wants to talk about at a party. I will talk to you to death about prosecutorial staffing and the census and budget incentives. That's why they matter, because no one wants to talk about them. Do you want to talk about the census? No, but it drives prison growth in ways you can't begin to comprehend, because where do prisoners count as living? In most states, it's in the prison, and that matters for representation, right? Boring, but it matters. So staffing. Two remarkable staffing features about prosecutors. Between 1970 and 1990, as crime went up, we hired 3,000 more prosecutors, from 17,000 to 20,000. From 1990 to 2007, as crime drops rapidly, we hired 10,000 more prosecutors, from 20,000 to 30,000. 3,000 more as crime rises, 10,000 more as crime falls. We don't have good data on prosecutorial behavior, on prosecutorial productivity, but using every proxy I can think of, each one tells the exact same story. The average ADA sitting at his desk today is no more punitive than the average ADA sitting at his desk in 1974. We just have 13,000 more of them than we did in 1974. We send 600,000 people to prison every year. We arrest 12 million people every year. If you're an ADA sitting at your desk with something you need to do, there is a case out there for you to charge. Of course you're going to charge it. You can't sit at your desk all day playing Minesweeper. You're going to get fired. This is what you are not, and it's not what you want to do. You went into this job to go after people who've committed crimes, and we have enough arrests for you to find something to do. There's also an interesting rural shift. During the same time, from 1974 to 2007, the number of counties with a full-time prosecutor goes from 45% to 85%. That's not Boston, that's not Brooklyn, that's not Philadelphia. We've all had full-time prosecutors for over a century now. That's your suburban and your rural counties. They're staffing up. They have small offices, 2, 3 prosecutors at most, but it used to be a guy who was part-time on the side. Now he is the prosecutor. That is his job, that's what he gets paid for, that is how he puts his kids through school. Of course he's going to be tougher. And it's worth pointing out that we need to start paying a lot of attention to rural America. Because if you look at decarceration, it's a completely urban phenomenon. Urban counties, those with populations of 250,000 or more, are decarcerating. Those with populations under 250,000 are incarcerating. I told you it's a California story. Outside California, it's not even a state story. Right? New York State has been decarcerating since 1999. New York State has not decarcerated. New York City has decarcerated. Everyone else has incarcerated. And we'll see a map in a second of county by county decarceration. Except for a few examples, you can never identify a state line. Because states aren't changing, counties are. And the rural counties are going one way, and the urban counties are going a different way. And there's lots of theories why, but no one's really paid much attention to this rural-urban phenomenon split that much. Some of it is politics. Some prosecutors now have greater political ambitions. And I know of at least one prosecutor, the DA, not the ADA, the DA, who in the year he ran for state AG became very aggressive. The year after he became less aggressive, and now he's a congressman. Right? And the theory is the fact that perhaps some DAs with political ambitions feel the need to be tougher on crime because that's what helps them make their national career. Again, most DAs are not running for some higher office, but likely those who are those from bigger cities whose impact will be greater. Right? And so there might be these growing political ambitions. Some of these we can see solutions for, but in the end, the toughest one there isn't a clear answer for. Pogo's right? I've seen the enemy, and he is us. As Americans, we tell people time and time again, in survey after survey after survey, that we favor rehabilitation over punitiveness. That's what we say, but it's not how we vote. right? We vote based on the one bad case. And prosecutors know this, and wisely they try to avoid it. To this day, anyone my age or slightly younger knows the name Willie Horton, right? Now, I should point out that that program that Willie Horton was involved in had over a 99% success rate. Everyone released on this furlough program came back without any problem, but one guy didn't. One guy. We know his name and no one else. And if you think that's outdated, how about the name of Daryl Dennis? Daryl Dennis, I believe. A single parolee in the state of Arkansas. Now, Arkansas in 2011 passed a wide series of reforms that led to a 10% drop in prison population. At the end of that year, they paroled Daryl Dennis, a single man in a very large state. That one man committed one murder. And that 10% drop turned into a net 7% gain the next year as parole and probation shut down completely because of one man. The politicians know this. And until we change our attitude, until we stop saying this one mistake will end your career, until we stop being a country that will send people to jail for not paying their library fines, which we do, it's hard to ask the prosecutors to be any more lenient than people who are voting them into office. So here's the other thing about being prosecutors. It creates sort of a conundrum for the reform movement. Because the fact of the matter is, no federal bill is going to solve this. No state bill is going to solve this. Prosecutors are elected by the county, and prosecutors are profoundly independent. Here are two examples. Start with the Rockefeller drug laws in New York State. Harshest drug laws in the country, passed in 1973, viewed as one of the most brutal, draconian laws the country has seen. I'm going to show you people in prison for New York State for drug offenses. There's Rockefeller drug laws. By 1984, 10 years after the Rockefeller drug laws went into effect, there are no more people in prison in New York State for drugs than in 1975. 10 years of Rockefeller drug laws, and the total number of people in New York State prisons for drugs hasn't moved. Albany says, be tough. And basically New York City said, no. Right? Now, what happens next is New York State becomes one of the most punitive states in the country for drugs. One of the largest percent of prison populations in the country for drugs. Now, 1984 is not a random year for this to happen. And it suggests, again, that many drug cases are pretextual attacks on violence. 1984 is when crack hits New York City, Buffalo, and other major urban areas in New York State. Now, here's the next interesting part. New York State has reformed the Rockefeller drug laws twice. In 2004, in a completely toothless kind of way, in no small part because of the census. And in 2009, for real. But that doesn't explain the trends in drug admits in New York State. They start dropping in 1994. And the two reform laws have no impact on that decline. Once again, DAs are ignoring what's happening in Albany. They're doing their own thing for their own internal reasons. Another way you can see it, the map I'm going to show you now is change in people sent by county to the state prison system between the period 2010 and 2014. Orange counties have sent fewer people in prison by 2014. Blue counties have more people in prison by 2014. And what you will see is, other than California, which is operating in its own unique situation due to its own unique problems with the Ninth Circuit and Supreme Court, and other than Mississippi and New Hampshire that have gotten more punitive, you cannot identify any state really on this map. Right? Where's Ohio on that map? Where's Michigan? If it weren't for the fact I don't have data on Idaho, you couldn't identify Washington or Oregon. Right? These are all states that have decarcerated, but you can't see in the data because the states aren't, the counties are. Right? Whatever the state law is doing, different counties react in different kinds of ways. And we have to solve this county by county by county. 2,500 DA offices nationwide. Now, I should point out that 60% of all cases are filed in just 10% of those counties. Right? We are a very densely populated country. That's why I can't stand that map that shows, like, look at how few places voted for Clinton and shows all the little blue islands across America. It's true. Very few places voted for Hillary Clinton. Those are just the places with people. Same thing is true with crime. Crime happens in those counties that have lots of people. So if you get 10%, you've done a huge impact. But you're going to have to go county by county. At the same time, there's something very protective about that, right? Policing reform is going to be completely derailed over the next 4 years. I don't pity the policing reform people. They are in for a world of hurt. I remain relatively optimistic because these county DAs, they don't care. The DAs in New York City don't care what Albany is saying. Do you think they care at all about what DC is saying? No. Right? So this American carnage rhetoric is not really going to push these DAs around that much. Prison reform might succeed. Prison reform might fail, but it's going to succeed and fail at the local county level, not because of what's coming out of DC. So what can we do? What steps can we take if we actually want to regulate prosecutors? So far, no policy is aimed at them. They've been almost completely untouched. But there's things we can do, right? So at least let's talk about what we should be able to do. Whoops. To start, sorry. Nope. Hold on. Sorry about this. There we go. All right. To start, let's just figure out what's going on. I have no data. I can't really tell you what they do because we gather no data. But yet, listening to the first panel, I began to realize maybe that's actually not my most pressing concern. So we want to know how DA behavior affects the community as a whole. Case file data can't tell us that. There's an amazing report out of Chicago that shows that 400 shootings in Chicago tied back to a single patient zero shooting. A shoots B, and then the retaliation shootings trickle out to their entire social network. Had you stopped A from shooting B at the start, those 400 shootings might not have happened, or it would have happened to a lesser extent. No single case file is going to tell you, oh, we got A in time, right? You'll never know who A is if you get it right. You won't even know who A is, right? What we need are DA offices willing to let us experiment, right? Try out policies and do them well. Randomly assign things across departments, see how different programs play out, to understand how these macro issues play out. Case file data is important. I can talk to you for hours about what data I want. I can talk to you for hours about how getting the wrong numbers reported in the wrong way could be worse than no numbers at all. But I think more important for figuring out what's going on is we need DA offices to let us experiment. Let the empiricists come in and run randomized trials on programs and behaviors and options and staffing and all these other things and use those macro results to figure out what works and what doesn't work at the DA level. Because recidivism, as a broad concept, trying to figure out just from the massive data, is that policing, is that economics, is that education, is that DA's office? We'll never disentangle the DA's office. But randomize a program and watch how that plays out through the system in a carefully done way can do a lot. My favorite option these days are charging and plea bargain guidelines. We're asking second-year prosecutors with no statistical training and a BA in English, right, and a law degree where they took no classes in public policy to figure out whether or not this guy poses a threat or not, right? That's an incredibly hard task to ask them to do. The idea they can do that with no regulation and no guidance is insane, right? I think one of the best jokes, which isn't really funny when you think about it, I've heard, came from Greg Newbern, who's the policy director for FAM down in Florida. And he said, what mandatory minimums mean is that we trust the prosecutor right up until the minute we elect him judge, right? We restrain judges all the time because we don't trust them. But who are judges? Prosecutors. We just moved on to the next career, right? So we trust them when they're younger, and we don't trust them and have more discretion. And we trust them less when they're older and more experienced and have more like political independence. That doesn't make sense, right? New Jersey does this for drug cases. They have plea bargaining guidelines that look like sentencing guidelines that restrain the kinds of deals that prosecutors can ask. I don't want internal office guidelines. I want something the defense attorney can appeal when the prosecutor doesn't abide by it. I want something that imposes real, meaningful external regulations that have been debated in a public forum that reflect the competing goals we have, not just what the prosecutors want, because I'll tell you in a second why the prosecutorial politics are really problematic, but something public and binding and appealable. Right, that provides structured guidance and some sort of legal constraints. No one else has the kind of discretion that prosecutors have. And the extent I have nothing against prosecutors. It's who I would have been if I weren't here. I just don't trust people. Right? I don't trust defense attorneys. I don't trust police. I don't trust judges. I don't trust jurors. I don't trust parole boards. I don't trust anyone. I trust math. At the end of the day, this is who I trust more than anyone, is something structured and rigorous. And there are problems with the math, but the problems with humans are worse. There's a huge moral hazard problem that we barely address. Prosecutors are elected by the county. They're almost inevitably funded by the county. But who pays for prisons? The state. If you send someone to jail with a misdemeanor, if you send them to probation with a misdemeanor, that comes out of the county budget, your budget. If you send them to prison, it comes out of the state budget. And if you think this is some abstract idea, a colleague of mine in a state with county-elected judges has told me that the judges have told her they think about this, that they send too many people to jail and not enough to prison, that they actually won't get reelected because the county machine won't help them. I'm not saying that individual prosecutors, even the DA at the top, have this thought, right? But we've created something that's free for them. And a fundamental rule of economics is that if something is free, you will overuse it. And prosecutors aren't any better humans than the rest of us. They will overuse a free resource. Right? The one reason why California has seen a huge drop is the only state in the country that has, sort of by accident, directly confronted this problem. Counties have to pick up a lot of these costs, and they're making choices they didn't have to make before. Perhaps we should improve voter engagement. When Brooklyn had a huge contested primary to replace our long-running DA, and in Brooklyn, obviously, the primary is the only thing that matters, and New York City has odd-numbered year elections, which is bizarre. Democratic turnout was 20%, and 20% of those voters didn't vote for the DA, right? Of those 20% who went to the polling booth, the number who voted for the DA compared to the mayor was 20% less. In 2012, when Cleveland had an open election for their DA, who elected McGinty, who did not prosecute Tamir Rice's shooters, something like 35% of those voters in the polling booth did not vote for the prosecutor. We don't vote for these elections. Small groups have tremendous amount of power because no one turns up. So maybe we should vote more. Or, conversely, we shouldn't vote at all. We are the only country in the world, the only one that elects the prosecutor. No one else does. And I, for one, fall within the category where if we're the only country that does it, my presumptions are probably doing it wrong, right? I'm not so skeptical of Western Europe to think that they're all wrong and somehow we managed to get it right and no one learned from us, right? There are risks how we elect prosecutors, and I'm going to show you the biggest risk in a second. Perhaps we should have some more appointed prosecutors, something more politically isolated, so you don't have to respond to the crime of the day, so the Daryl Dennises and don't derail the entire process. Because the head of New York State, the former head of New York State's parole board, said that all their parole decisions are driven by exactly one thought, drives every parole decision in New York State. Whatever you do not end up on the front page of the New York Post or the New York Daily News. That's it. Everything else is noise, but that's the overriding goal. So you've got a high-profile former murderer who deserves parole, like the one from the armored bank robbery, whose name I'm forgetting, who the governor changed her sentence to make her parole eligible, denied her first time up. Of course she's going to be denied, because you aren't going to be the one who's going to sign your name on that. Because if you sign your name and someone says jaywalks, you lose your job, right? Because you're immediately responsible to the electorate in a way that no other Western democracies' criminal justice actors are. And that creates a tremendous, unenviable pressure on them to be tough. Right? We say be lenient, but we'll punish you if you make a mistake. And it's because the mistakes are obvious, right? If you are too lenient, then your opponent can say, look, you let Bob out, and Bob killed Mary. So what do you tell Mary's family that you let Bob out? Now, what about the guy who's too harsh? Well, the guy who's too harsh is to turn to me, right? And I go and say, hey, look, I ran the models, and I can tell you that risk pool A in your prison, they really shouldn't be in prison, right? Because the expected recidivism rate of risk pool A is like 5%. Yes, 5 of those 100 can recidivate, but risk pool A really shouldn't be in prison. So my guy has table 16 pointing to risk pool A to try to win the election. His opponent points to Mary's grieving family. Who's going to win that election every single time, right? Severity is politically powerful. Leniency is politically risky. And we make our actors politically accountable. That is a problem. And then the final point, we magnify that problem by the way in which we elect prosecutors. They're elected by the county. Now, outside of a few places, what do cities look like? Cities consist of a city and then a ring suburb that's part of that same county. That suburb is wealthier, whiter, more conservative, safer, and far more politically powerful. Right? This is one of the most important, yet I think underappreciated ways in which race plays a very powerful role in the outcomes we see in criminal justice. Wealthy white suburbanites elect the prosecutors, who in turn enforce criminal law in poor, more minority urban centers. Costs and benefits are fundamentally split. Now, to be clear, the people in those urban areas, in the high crime areas, benefit the most from accurate and effective enforcement, right? And this is the challenge that Jim Foreman's recent book, Lock and Row, poses, right? Oftentimes, poor minority communities can be very punitive because they bear the full cost of crime as well. But the challenge we face is that the system we've created has separated costs and benefits. The suburbanites feel the safety of tough on crime policies. When they go to work, things feel safer. When they go to the city on a Friday night to see a show, things feel safer. They believe that that the local city police narcotics team is taking out drug dealers. Drugs aren't going to come to their kids' suburban schools. It's a lie they tell themselves, but it's what they tell themselves. But they don't feel the costs. It's not their brother, not their uncle, not their nephew, not their son, not their daughter who's being needlessly stopped, needlessly arrested, excessively charged, excessively convicted, or excessively locked up. When you split the costs and the benefits, of course we're going to overemphasize the benefits, crime reduction, and underemphasize the costs, so the social disruption we have that comes from prisons. And prison is profoundly socially disruptive. People tell me that by arguing we should be less punitive, that the prisons are full of violent crimes, I've undermined the case of prison reform. I disagree. And I disagree because we don't count half the cost of prisons. Right? We don't count the cost that prison throws off dating, that actually malforms family formation, because you can't actually get married in a neighborhood where the male-female ratio is 60-40. Right? That's a leading vector of tuberculosis, HIV, and STDs. That being released from prison is a major predictive risk factor of dying from a drug overdose, because you go from taking a small amount of low-quality drugs that are expensive to a large amount of high-quality drugs that are cheap, and you die from a drug overdose. Do we tie that back to prison? No. How about the labor impact on prison? You work fewer hours, you get paid less per hour, so the overall economic impact is significant. Right? There are profound social costs to incarceration that we ignore, right? That we just don't count. Right? RAs this summer crawling through everything they can find to try to just figure out how to count these things. Right? And so all these costs are borne by the community that has the least amount of political voice, given the way we choose prosecutors, because they're being swamped by the suburbs. And an example of this is that when Kim Foxx won in Chicago, she won the suburbs and the city of Chicago. But Chicago breaks out their voting records by Chicago and the ring counties. And she won by 10 points more in the city. She won 65-35 in the city of Chicago. And she won 55-45 in the suburbs that hold half the population. Take Laquan McDonald out of the Chicago scenario, and we might be looking at the second term of Anita Alvarez, right? She barely lost the suburbs, right? The whiter, wealthier, more conservative Chicago suburbs. And Chicago suburbs aren't nearly as conservative relative to the city as they used to be. Right? And so I think there are ways we can fix this. They require us to think differently and bigger than we do, but the prosecutor remains the lone unregulated figure in all of this. And there are steps we can take that no one is taking, and we continue to ignore them. And I think it's time to really start trying to think about how we can change the way prosecutors' offices are designed. So thank you.